To you, whose meek visage lies in the shadow of my warriors, my handcrafted armaments of flesh, muscle, and bone, you will see a genetic horror, a perversion of what you consider pure or untainted. However, this is merely denial, a deception you tell yourself to justify your natural inadequacies. For what you face is beyond you, an unprocurable existence. It is this which you shall take heed to know, the name of this warrior. He is Helsing, and he is Legion. Explosions, fire and sundered earth. That's all that Regel is now, thought Guile as he sat against the trench wall. A trench that stretched over 800 kilometers from one end to another and could barely fit 2 people along its width. Said trench was mirrored by the enemies. At least Guile and his unit thought so. No one had successfully crossed the near kilometer-and-a-half that made up the no-man's land in between the 2 twin trench lines. Guile was a fairly tall man, well tall for a crypter, around 6'2", give or take. He had strong, rugged features partially obscured by a goatee, pale, smooth skin interrupted around his left eye, where a large scar decorated his face from forehead to cheek directly down, and bright orange eyes. As the second lieutenant of the 211th Infantry Company, he had the opportunity to see more battlefields than the average Jekyll, and Regel had to be one of the more notable. It was a mineral-rich desert planet with little vegetation and barely passable atmosphere, a truly miserable place without the roaring sounds of artillery fire. If anything, it improved the place. Regel, or Planetary Body 255, and its surrounding planets in the Hephaestus system are the latest worlds designated for the sovereignty's expansion. As always, reconnaissance units were deployed to determine whether it was an occupied system, and, if so, collect information of the soon-to-be enemy of the sovereignty. However, after nearly a solar month of waiting for a report back, Fleet Admiral Aureus ordered the fleet to proceed into the system, blind and in spite of protests from the likes of Colonel Husk. Though it was only a rumor, it had been said that Brigadier General Rolland had sent direct communications to the Admiral, advising against entering the system without the proper amount of information on the planets and the then assumed local inhabitants. What their tech level was? How populous were they as a society? What response could be expected? Despite it having been a rumor, Guile believed it to be true. The Brigadier General was a scrupulous man and one of the most accomplished military leaders in the sovereignty's history. The likelihood he would have said anything to the Fleet Admiral or Colonel Husk was, suffice it to say, highly unlikely. Unfortunately, however, he was apparently ignored, and the fleet made its way into the system. Within a single solar day, they encountered the enemy, the Gel, a bipedal insectoid species that were roughly as advanced as the sovereignty, and had colonized seemingly every habitable world in the Hephaestus system. 7 worlds and 4 moons. They had been waiting by the first moon at the edge of the system and had sent out a single hail. However, it was unintelligible, given that the language of the Gel was little more than screeches and mandible clicks. Without standing on ceremony, the Corvus Helsing's lead battle reaver, a metropolis-sized industrial void ship of war over 129 kilometers long and half that wide, fired its main plasma cannons at the lead Gel ship. The massive pitch-colored craft was blocky and industrial in design, sleek only at the craft's forward section. Once its main guns were fired, the violet glow of the plasma illuminated the craft menacingly. None doubted its dominating power and assumed the enemy craft's destruction even before the plasma projectiles made purchase on the enemy craft. However, to the shock of all with a view in the fleet, the Gel craft remained unscathed. It seemed they possessed a form of energy shielding not unlike the Sovereignty's own. This was when Guile, his men, and the entire fleet knew this was to be an actual war, not a simple one-sided invasion. In quick succession, the Jekyl's 45-kilometer Sanguine frigates and 70-kilometer Hellbearer battleships opened fire on the enemy fleet, with both plasma cannons and phase beam batteries. The war between the Sovereignty's 11th Fleet and the Gel had begun. The Gel's ships took the initial wave of abuse with their shields holding, but only just. Their ships were as large as the Sovereignty's craft, it seemed, with each of their own variants. Their ships were shaped like pyramids, with smooth paneling and no visible hatches, bays, or entrances. Though after the initial volley of fire had begun from the Sovereignty, their weapons began suddenly appearing from numerous hatches that flung open from the previously smooth paneling across the orange surface of their craft. The two fleets were locked in vicious combat. Once both sides' shields failed, the destruction wrought left many a new recruit believing they had harnessed the power of the gods in each space-defying craft. Violet phase beams fired from the Sovereignty ships, and yellow rays of energy from the Gels sliced clean through each other's hulls like a red-hot knife through butter, and the plasma projectiles soaring through the vacuum like miniature suns made impact upon the engaged hulks with blinding explosions. And no doubt, if there were air to carry the shockwave, it would feel as if reality itself were being ripped apart all around you. The fleet-to-fleet engagement ended with the Gel retreating after the Helsings had launched boarding fangs upon their flagship. Boarding fangs are a type of drill-like projectile pod which utilized a superheated neckrite drill to breach any still operating energy shielding at high speeds and embed into an enemy craft. The fangs were only usable by Helsings, as they could withstand the abuse of the impact such a craft entailed. The super soldiers successfully shredded through the Gel's internal forces of their flagship and sabotaged it by setting off explosive charges in the craft's core. As quickly as they had come, they left the enemy craft and rejoined the fleet with minimal casualties. The same could not be said for the rest of the fleet, however. Out of 63 void craft they'd arrived with, 12 Sanguine frigates were destroyed outright, 2 Hellbearer battleships were crippled, and 1 Helsing battle raver had been partially disabled. In Guile's living memory, this had been the worst opening confrontation to any of the campaigns he had been a part of over the last 80 years. Over 38 wars with varying species of Xenos, and none had begun like this. It was a costly first thrust into the Hephaestus system, and things would only escalate. The fleet took 2 months to make repairs en route to the first planetary bodies, intentionally not using full-throttle engines or the void burst drives. Just thinking of rereading the technical manuals from the Advanced Officer Training course in regards to void burst drives made Guile want to shoot himself. Index Gamma 8. Technical Note Outline. Void burst is the glorious Sovereignty's form of faster-than-light travel, abbreviated in many a documentation, FTL, which, as the name suggests, a burst of dark energy shifting space-time and matter around the given void craft, propelling it forward from the main engines. Slingshotting? Forgive the slang terminology. Engineers are notoriously brash and flippant in regards to matters of documentation, it forth in space. In tandem, the initial dark energies around the ship, emanated both from the main engines and conductor coils across the craft's outer hull, solidified the laws of physics inside the craft. For those of applicable status, see Index Gamma 80. Thus, while the ship is ripping through the expanse of space at immense speeds, it is safely contained inside a protective mucus of dark energy. This protects the craft and its inhabitants from being plastered through bulkheads into mush. Again, due apologies for our engineers' choice descriptors, with the inertia such speeds generate. The decision not to use these miracles of engineering was a combination of cautious approach and fear of exposure. Given their enemy possessed similar technology to the Sovereignty's own, they also had to assume they possessed the ability to detect void bursts. If they could detect where the ship burst from, they could then easily calculate the designated trajectory. Therefore, the Fleet Admiral chose the slow progression approach, no doubt advised by the Brigadier General, or simply choosing to use his brain for once. This leads to Giles posting upon Regel, as it was christened. As if we had already won, Gile thought as he shambled along the trench and past numerous other Jekylls of the 211th, trying to get a better view of a slight bit of movement he had noticed along the enemy trench. The soldiers' uniforms consisted of long black and grey trench coats under a plated vest and shoulder pads. Each of them bore helmets possessing 2 large, glowing red lenses for the eyes, decorating a thick layer of metal plating just underneath a broad white metal visor bearing the emblem of their regiment, a black laughing skull flanked by black wings. They must be reorganizing to assault us, thought Gile as he brought up his rifle to view down the scope. The computerized lens scanned about and detected the same movement Gile had noticed a moment ago, and further magnified. But after its magnification, resolution cleared. Nothing. Whatever the movement had been, it had ceased. Sighing with frustration, Gile dropped to the ground and sat against the trench wall, allowing his rifle to fall against it next to him. No enemy contact in over 30 hours, with the exception of both sides lopping artillery back and forth, both trying to coax the other to make a drastic, and no doubt fatal, mistake. The mature soldier leaned his head back against the brown gravel wall and gazed up at the sky of this rock. The clouds were thick and dark, with no colour to them. If it had been thundering, Gile would not have been able to tell due to the artillery fire and the shuddering of the earth with each launch and impact. He took a deep breath in and winced. The smell was an acrid odour of sulphur and mud, though there was one other smell, that of blood. As this campaign on Regel had gone on for so long, and with so few rations being afforded to all fronts appropriately, the scent presented an issue. Jekylls were well trained and disciplined, often performing survival courses where they would be put through their paces in desperate scenarios. Part of those courses were that of combating the thirst when blood rations were unavailable. Despite this, nearly 3 weeks without fresh troops and fresh blood was pushing the men's self-control. Gile himself was feeling his psyche being clawed at whenever he allowed his mind to wander too much. If we do not get relief soon, the enemy will not be the ones to kill us off, Gile thought darkly. Footsteps approached, and Gile instinctively grabbed hold of his rifle while looking over, very alert. However, the approaching steps were merely 2 of his company officers. Both saluted while keeping relatively crouched to avoid sticking out over the trench as sniper bait, and sat across from Gile in the trench. Gile recognized them even with their helmets on and name patches frayed away. The taller, more brawny of the 2 was Sergeant Follig Brooke, a very self-assured, confident man, not far from Gile himself in age, and most certainly not in experience. The other was Corporal Tulig Grimm, a shorter, leaner man, but don't let that fool you. He'd tussled with the worst of the worst and came out nigh unscathed on the other side of every firefight he'd been ordered into. "Permission to remove helmet, sir?" Brooke asked with a voice so deep, you'd swear that helmet of his had a modified audio filter. Gile nodded, and the 2 removed their helmets. Brooke was revealed to be completely bald, with numerous scars dotting his face. He had robust features, a thick jawline, and one of his eyes was wide, having been permanently blinded from a stray shot with an energy weapon in a past war, soon to be forgotten. It was likely there were plenty of scars on his upper lip too, but a thick brown handlebar mustache camouflaged it. "Thank Maya I can take this bloody thing off," Tulig said exasperately, tearing off his helmet to reveal softer features than either Gile or Brooke possessed. His hair was blonde and cut short like most military officers, and he had virtually no wrinkles, except some around his eyes which were a bit sunken in, though his face was angular, with a slightly disfigured chin. Apparently he'd gotten into a drunken brawl when he was 13 against his father, who shattered nearly every bone in Tulig's body, though only 1 blow to the face. The whole regiment joked that was the reason he was so tough while still retaining some good looks. You can't blame the helmet for being so tight. It has to humble you by containing your overinflated ego. A challenge most unenviable," Brooke stated with jest. His delivery was drier than desert sand, but if anything, that made it all the more funny. "Is that jealousy I hear betwixt your words? Weep, old man, for the Empress herself would demand me to her chambers. Were we to meet, her greatness would know a nightly satisfaction well and truly above that which those palace concubines could even achieve given a millennia," Tulig said boastfully, though he delivered the words in an exaggerated posh noblesse. Index Epsilon 1. Decorum Note Outline. Noblesse is the cryptic dialogue spoken exclusively by high nobility within the sovereignty, and is hard to understand by commoners normally. Though if one is assigned enough service jobs underneath such nobles, it's common for even low-born crypta to learn the basics. Grimoire, the core language of the sovereignty, has 3 dialects in total. Outside of noblesse, there is basic Grimoire and Skulk. Most commoners typically spoke basic Grimoire, which is less drawn out and complex than noblesse, and more flowing and comprehensive than Skulk. Skulk is less of a dialect than a language all to itself, with its roots lying within Grimoire, and is typically spoken by the lowest of the low. Scavengers, bandits, raiders and gangers that live in undergroves, the labyrinth of foundations massive sovereignty cities were built upon. Brooke bellowed a hearty laugh at the young corporal's delivery, throwing a playful punch to his shoulder which landed with a thud. Guile couldn't help but crack a smile at their banter. The 3 of them were an anomaly where the Jekyll armed forces were concerned. The average soldier mortality rate aside, even the survivors of a given battle were unlikely to leave with more than a soldier or 2 they knew, let alone ones they called friend. Yet, there they sat, 3 men who had seen more than a dozen battles alongside one another, and had lived to see even more. "Well, how fare the men?" Guile asked plainly after the chuckles had passed. Both officers looked at each other for a brief moment before responding, and then returning their gazes to Guile. "Not well, to be perfectly honest, sir," Brooke said darkly. "That's an understatement," Tulig said with a scoff. "Half the men are down to their last few days of blood rations, and the other half are either offering their last sort to the others or already depleted what they had left." Guile looked at them both without surprise, though concern was still present in his expression. "I take it neither of you have heard reports as to when we'll receive relief, any more than I have then?" Guile asked with a sigh. Both officers shook their heads. "Then we'll have to rely on the medical corps." Brooke's eyes looked hollow at this, and Tulig's handsome face contorted to an ugly expression. "So our only hope is that enough of our men die to feed the rest then?" Tulig said, barely containing his frustration. Guile looked at him seriously. "Aye, lad. It appears that's the way of it for now," Guile said calmly, but with a level of consolation mixed into the delivery of his words. Tulig squeezed his fists tightly, but refrained from escalating his frustrations to an outburst. "Sergeant, head down and make the request in person for us. Rather not radio the grim task." Brooke nodded stiffly, immediately got up and moved quickly while keeping low down the trench line. Guile and Tulig made eye contact again after a few minutes. "Last time things were this bad, it would have been AUKUS 7, right?" Tulig asked abruptly. Guile immediately knew what he was getting at, but let the corporal continue. "Tens of thousands made planetfall after the initial force had been left to squalor for over 3 months, all while the main force was held in orbit. In that case, we were fighting a technologically inferior race, with minimal opposition to be had in orbit for our fleet's blockade," Guile added promptly. "Aye, yet our forces were held back when the war could have been ended in a matter of a day. And what was the reason for that delay, Lieutenant?" Tulig asked with bemusement. Guile looked at the younger officer with every attempt being made at maintaining his stoic expression. Alas, however, something must have indicated his agreement of the corporal's notions in his face, because Tulig's own eyes intensified and narrowed towards Guile. The lieutenant smiled dully, and in clear frustration, he let out a heavy sigh. It was entirely unnecessary to finish Tulig's recollections aloud. Guile remembered quite well how the bastards in orbit held back the attack. It was due to a dispute between two noble families on Mordred, the Sovereignty's homeworld, who were interested in claiming Orca 7 as their own once the 11th Fleet had dealt with the vermin inhabiting it. One of the vying noble families was related to the fleet admiral, who had delayed any dropships from descending to the battle lines until the negotiations favored their family. The other family vying had been a close friend of Colonel Husk, who then refused to give his troops the order to make planetfall, lest the family he had been aligned with receive better favor in the negotiations. Colonel Husk was normally a very duty-bound military man held in high regard by most jackals in the 11th Fleet. Thus, it can be strongly inferred whatever debt he owed must have been substantive. Regardless, the results were 86,049 dead sons of the Sovereignty, 3,000 armored crawlers, and 822 mammoth bastions. Had the war been lost, the Empress would have heard of it, and the noble families responsible would not have escaped her wrath. Alas, the war had been won, and both families had benefited from the gamble, while the jackals of the 11th Fleet mourned their brothers. "Think the same thing is happening this time?" Tulig asked exasperately, lying his head back onto the dirt wall of the trench. He looked up to the smog-filled sky with a look of tension comprising his face. Guile questioned his response for a moment. "No, something feels different this time. More," Guile began before Tulig cut in. "Planned?" he said without looking back down from the sky. "Aye," Guile responded darkly. The two soldiers sat for a few moments more, and then Tulig returned his gaze back to his lieutenant. "I'll go check on a few of the others over here." He gestured towards the group of soldiers Guile had moved around to get a better look across to the enemy trench to study the strange shift in their ranks. The younger soldier begrudgingly donned his helmet once more and began to move. "Corporal," Guile said as Tulig began to move to the men. The corporal looked toward his commanding officer, his helm hiding any potential expression to Guile's words. The second lieutenant considered his words for a moment tentatively. Finally, he settled on, "Don't do anything stupid." "Sorry, sir. Fresh out of stupid. Brooke took it all, the greedy bastard," the corporal said in a cocky fashion through the mechanical filter of his helmet. Guile chuckled and watched his young friend move along the trench, keeping his head low. It was then Guile sat alone once more, took in the sulphuric air, and comprehended all that had happened, all that he believed could happen in the future, and attempt to just calm his mind for a few minutes. As Guile sat, closing his eyes in the attempt to hear anything past the boom of bombs descending on target areas of each trench, some only a few meters shy of their position, he began to feel a new rumble different from those of the artillery impacts. This new rumble was not a sudden shake and an end. No, this was a rumble that became louder and emanated from beneath the ground, beneath him. Guile realized what was going on a moment too late. Standing tall, in spite of the ground beneath him protesting, he began to call out across the trenches. "Enemy below!" Before the second lieutenant could finish, however, the ground beneath their position in the center of the trench burst forth like a volcanic eruption. Instinctually, Guile leapt back from the source at the exact moment of entry. Despite the dust plume tickling his exposed eyes, Guile forced himself to look to the newly formed opening. The lieutenant made out a small, circular hole, roughly 2 meters or so in diameter, trimmed with jagged metal prongs. A vehicle of some sort that had burrowed underneath them. Luckily, the eruption of the enemy's subterranean vehicle only eviscerated 2 of Guile's men into bisected cadavers of bloody gore. The rest of the men had reflexively moved to either side of the fresh opening. Without hesitation, Guile drew his neck-right longsword and activated it. Coursing red energy emanated all along the blade's edge, the air around it warping from the emanated heat. "Activate bayonets and fire at will!" Guile bellowed. His voice boomed with commanding vigor, albeit with a hoarse lint at the end of each word. The Jekyll soldiers did as they were bid, bayonets at the end of their rifles alight with the same red hue as Giles' own blade, and they began to open fire just as the enemy began pouring out at them. The bayonets did their job well when the sprung insectoids closed the distance between them and their would-be victims. The armored insectoid soldiers, akin to 2-meter-tall wasps without wings, had their carapaces blasted straight through by gunfire and sliced to ribbons by the neck-right bayonets. However, the Jekylls could not hope to hold off the swarm that continuously flowed from the freshly produced entrance in their trench. Jekyll after Jekyll fell as the Gel's overwhelming numbers took hold. They surrounded and mobbed each soldier and bit heads clean off shoulders with their mandibles, or goring open their chests with razor-sharp claws on their hands. The few dozen men in this section of trench were being whittled away. Based on the yelling Guile had heard further away, the rest of the company were no doubt set upon in the same manner as those in this part of the trench. Guile shrugged off his nihilism quickly and bolted forward into the coming swarm. If they were to die, he would not go out merely barking orders like a beaten hound. Guile moved with incredible speed and agility. In the blink of an eye, he passed 2 of his remaining soldiers, and, in a blur of motion, sliced off 3 of the coming Gel's heads with a single stroke of his blade. He didn't allow this act to go unaccompanied, and quickly lowered his stance as he readjusted the blade's edges in his hand, and slashed in the opposite direction at another row of incoming drones, this time at their midriff. The searing blade passed right through their metal-like carapaces with ease, the excessive heat from the blade causing their pasty yellow innards to explode forth in a projectile manner. As Guile adjusted his stance once more, an enemy drone tore forward at him. Reflexively, Guile stepped back whilst drawing the blade back in parallel motion to his positioning, preparing to thrust forward. The old soldier did just that as the enemy closed, and he thrust the blade out with blinding speed and crippling force. The blade made purchase through the bug's lower chest. However, Guile noticed only too late that this one had a device embedded in its carapace. The device made a high-pitched whir, and at the very same second, Guile felt a tug from behind. In a blinding flash of light, Guile watched in slow motion as his right arm, his sword arm, was left behind as he was tugged away. The soldier that had yanked him away moved to shield the rest of him from the shockwave, and then, boom! The whole world had become an eerie ring of a high-pitched cacophony and pain. No other sensation seemed present for a time. Then, after a few moments, the worst of the ring subsided. Guile opened his eyes to a faint blur. It took but a few seconds for that too to subside. Guile was flat against the ground on his back with a heavy weight upon his chest, struggling to lift his head. The second lieutenant merely glanced along his chest to see the source of the weight. It was the torso of the Jekyll soldier who had saved him. The remains of the man had no left arm, and where the abdomen would meet the chest, there were only trailing intestines with a river of blood to match. Guile took in the sight, and after a moment or two, the old soldier realized who the mound of lifeless flesh lying upon him had been. Two-Leg. The physical pain seemed to go numb with this revelation. Not just the pain, either, but the whole world seemed meaningless for a few moments. All other considerations voided in Guile's mind as the eviscerated torso of his friend lay atop him. He looked in Two-Leg's left eye, which was visible due to his helmet's face mask splintering from a combination of the explosive shockwave and shrapnel. The eye was like that of a doll's, hollow and lifeless, indicative of only a life that had once been there, now suddenly gone. Guile lay there for mere seconds, but for him it might as well have been an eternity. Battle after battle they'd fought, and countless times Guile had seen Two-Leg run through traps, distract enemies with nothing but a flare and sheer obnoxious dumb luck, and worst of all, test his luck with the female Jekylls of the medical and sniper corps several times over. He had survived all of it, endlessly, yet this is how he was to die. On some backwater bug world surrounded by nothing but mud and the moans of starving brothers in arms which he was helpless to aid. To make it worse, he could have saved himself, Guile thought. He could have run faster than any of us and regrouped, lived to fight another day, to have a future for himself and what men he could lead. Yet you stupidly saved me! Guile was screaming internally, and his face contorted to reflect it as he stared endlessly into the dead eye before him. However, with sheer force of will, Guile silently and internally composed himself. That's not Two-Leg. That's just a corpse. That's not Two-Leg. That's just a corpse. The old lieutenant recited in his mind like scripture, till he at least half believed it. Guile roughly turned his head to view his right side, hoping to see his right arm still there, despite the pain he felt being already quite the confirmation of its loss. Alas, there it was not, merely another river of blood coming from the shredded stump of meat and bone that extended to where his elbow had been. The skin was in tatters at the edge of the stump, like shredded cloth. It flapped about awkwardly with the spasms that came from the arm ejecting forth blood. The old soldier smiled grimly, his eyes already looking glazed, as he forced his head to look straight to the heavens. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, breathing becoming more of a labor with each continuous attempt to ingest air. Had I been like the legends of our people's forebears, I would already be dead. But the bleeding will stem if I can hold my consciousness for a few more moments, Guile thought to himself, though even he knew that only meant his death would take longer to come. As vulnerable as he was, it was only a matter of time before the enemy would have gutted him, or worse. Death by bleed-out would be far less painful overall, yet he couldn't shake the desire to hold, to maintain himself in the hopes that aid was not out of reach. It was irrational, and he knew that, yet the hope lingered foolishly. Guile's full hearing finally returned, as indeed the blood flowing from his arm began to slow. With it came the noise of heavy scuttering and clicking mandibles. The enemy was right there, possibly all around him at the very moment. Well, get on with it, you bastards, and rid me of the wretched sound of your incessant clicking, Guile thought in frustration. He hadn't felt fear in that moment. All jackals had that beaten out of them in training. Any remnant of it died in their first deployments, and Guile had been on countless since his first. In fact, death as a companion, not an adversary, was the unofficial motto of the 211th Jackal Regiment. As he recalled the motto, Two-Leg's face came to mind once more. No, it was not fear he felt, but impatience. Regardless of how much it annoyed him, Guile continued to listen to the enemy, as he could not risk lifting his head to see them, so his only option was to listen. It took another few minutes, but eventually Guile heard the approaching steps of the bugs. They were coming to check to see if he was dead. Took you long enough. Enjoyed the sights enough, have we? Get on with it, he thought briskly. Every ounce of the old soldier wanted to scream these same words, yet he lacked the strength. Ferry me to my brothers. Finally, one of the drones came into view above Guile's face, and it looked inquisitively at him. Its massive, octagon-patterned eyes peered down at him. It was impossible to read its thoughts, but there was no doubt it knew he was alive. After all, Guile had no intention of hiding that fact. He stared directly at the thing with a steely conviction. If he could, he would spit at the thing out of sheer spite. However, again, the strength of the desired act eluded Guile. The alien leaned down slowly towards Guile's face, opening up its mandibles, revealing a mouth of razor-sharp teeth. It was going to eat him alive. As the mandibles clamped onto either side of his face, embedding into the flesh and drawing yet more blood, Guile thought of the Empress and the sovereignty he had spent all his life serving. Will they remember me? Was the last coherent thought that ran through his mind before the screaming began, as the insect ravenously tore away chunks of his face. Its razor-toothed maw greedily devoured his flesh before him. It seemed to intentionally leave his eyes for last as it tore away his nose, then his lips, and so on. All the while, the man screamed and howled desperately for a mercy that would not come.